So I don't know if you remember where you were and who taught you to swim. Remember this? I mean, I went to a YMCA class. They also divided out between the little kids and the older kids, like minnows, guppies. Any of this sound familiar? Tadpoles. If you got a little older, you could be a dolphin. The older kids got to be sharks. But when you first start out, the sheer terror of going into the deep end is just something you can't even wrap your head around. In fact, if you're just learning how to swim, you stay in the shallow end of the pool for good reason. It's safe there. You can put your feet on the ground. You're not going to be afraid of what's going to happen. And if you are afraid, just grab onto the side of the pool and hold on for dear life. There's also a demarcation that tells you when the deep end is. And if you remember what it was like to be a child, it looked like the whole world just dropped off. You were terrified. That little mark on the side of the pool was as much on the side of the pool as it was in your mind. You just did not cross it. There's a phobia and fear for people in swimming. Do you realize that 46% of Americans fear the deep in swimming pools? There are 39% of the people, that's an extraordinary figure, who are afraid of submerging their head underwater. I have a friend of mine who tells me and others that when he was a little kid, he was standing beside a pool, didn't know how to swim. His father just picked him up and threw him into the water. He wanted to teach him an important lesson about life. And I think about that, and I think what you taught him was never to trust your dad again. The idea that somehow you're going to sink or swim, that's how you're going to fight through life is a reality, but you don't want your father being the one who throws you into the deep end of the pool unless you're ready to go. Some of you know that feeling all too well about being thrown into the deep end of the pool. I'd suggest this church has been thrown into the deep end of the pool. I would suggest it wasn't even ready for it, but it just happened. And so you find yourself in a deeper water, struggling to stay alive, making sure whatever you can do with God's help to be there and be safe. But a lot of you were thrown into the deeper waters. You didn't expect it. You didn't ask for it. You didn't want it. You didn't invite it. It was the divorce you didn't expect, the health issue that arose. It was the adult child that continues to need help. It was the job that laid you off. Suddenly your life changed. You didn't know what was going to happen. You felt like something was going to kill you. And you were forced to either swim or sink, survive or not. If you ever spent time reading the Gospels, you'll know that Jesus asked questions over and over again. In fact, actually asked more questions than people ask of him, which I think is fascinating. We always think Jesus has all the answers. I think Jesus also has the right questions, which is the essential part of arriving at the right answers. So he would ask questions over and over again. Do you love me? Are you also going to leave? Why are you so afraid? How long do I have to put up with you? Do you still not understand? Piercing questions. I think there's one that absolutely cuts and shreds to the heart of an individual, and it's in this story. And what Sharon just read to you is a longer story. But you begin to sort of take it and see what it is. He encounters this person who for 38 years has been sitting beside this pool that has a reputation that all the people who need help, to have physical infirmities or whatever it may be dealing with, if they sit on the side of this pool, and if somehow they sense that the waters are stirred or there's bubbles coming up, maybe that's the spirit that's moving. First one in the pool gets healed. But he's never the first one. In fact, he's always just sitting beside the waters. He's not able to get in. And the most piercing question that Jesus asks, and he doesn't just ask individually, he also asks us, do you want to get well? And you would think the person would respond, well, of course I want to get well. I've been here 38 years. How much more do you think I want to get healed? But instead he gets defensive. Well, I don't have anybody to put me in. I need help. There's nobody to even help me, which also tells you maybe there's a deeper root to his problem, because what Jesus sees is not an invalid. What he sees is a person who's living in the defeat. It's resignation. I've been doing this for so long. That's all it'll ever will be. I come here every single day. I've long since lost any hope that something's going to change, but I still show up. 38 years waiting for something to happen, and nothing ever does. And as he begins to get defensive, Jesus begins to ask him, do you want to get well? Which is the essential question for us individually. At times in our life, what do you really want and what are you willing to do with it? So he's waiting for 38 years. And what he's trying to say is, as soon as I see the bubbles rise, as soon as that happens, then I'll be able to, somebody will help me to jump in and get healed. And you and I can fall into that trap as soon as you played this game before, as soon as the kids are gone, we'll start living. As soon as I get the job I want, everything's going to be fine. As soon as I get a promotion, then the path will be clear. As soon as I graduate from college, you just go down the list. We do this all the time, as soon as. And then you find yourself in this waiting period. As soon as something happens, then you're still waiting on something else to happen as well. Do you realize when you dig deep in this passage, this is what I want you to do. Because on the surface, it looks like somebody is healed by Jesus, which he is, and he ought to be ecstatic. But there's a different sort of tenor to this story if you look deeply into it. He doesn't jump into the water. There's no indication that he does what he came to do. What Jesus says to him is, stand up, take your mat, and walk. He doesn't profess his faith in Christ. He doesn't say, I believe, but help my unbelief. He doesn't go through this whole machinization. He doesn't do anything, but he just does that one thing that Jesus tells him to do. In fact, if you read the story further, he's not the example of a faithful person that you and I would normally think about. People are asking Pharisees because they want to trap Jesus. Well, who actually told you to get up and walk? You know what the man says? I don't know. He doesn't even know who Jesus is. He didn't have the sense of who Jesus might even be. He just knows he walked away. His life has changed, but he didn't bother even to find out his name or a little bit about who he was. The whole point of this story, if you dig deep, is not to tell you how good this person is. It's actually to tell you how good God is. And that's the way Jesus did over and over again. We think these passages, stories, parables are all about us. They're about the goodness of God. In spite of ourselves, in spite of our lack of faith, in spite of the way in which we carry out our lives, that God's going to do things for us, help us, heal us, nurture us, and guide us as well. Martin Buber is a great theologian, wrote a number of books, one of which he talked about two different kinds of faith. The kind of faith that you and I are familiar with is belief. What do you believe? Well, that's the thing we wrestle with in this culture. So what does your church believe? What's your doctrine? What's your statement? What do you believe? You ask an individual, what do you believe? That seems to be the litmus test. And then we can figure out whether you belong or not. Or we find out what you believe. We can figure out whether or not you're a true Christian or not. What do you believe? Martin Buber said there's another kind of faith. You can take the same original Greek and Aramaic language. The word belief can also be translated as trust. So just hear it differently. Because we're fixated on belief, as if we have to get the right information, the right doctrine, the right dogma. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son so that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but have eternal life. Read it in a different way. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son so that everyone who trusts in him may not perish, but have eternal life. Essence of faith, if you boil it down, is not just belief, because beliefs can change. Trust is what you say, even when you don't understand. Even if you don't know what you don't know, you trust in goodness of God. And that's what Jesus is saying over and over again. He's telling these stories. It's not a shallow story. He doesn't want you to remain in this sort of shallow theological waters, which happens to a lot of us. He wants you to go deep, because it's easy. He knows, I know, you know, to stay in the shallow end, where it's safe. You can cling to the side of the pool. You never have to venture out. The problem is you have a shallow life, and a shallow prayer and a shallow theology ultimately results in a shallow life, which is what none of us actually want. And if you decide in your life just to stay where it's comfortable, in the shallow part of the pool or the shallow part of life, you can survive. You'll be comfortable. And if you stay there and resist any opportunities to go any deeper, I think eventually God just sort of leaves you alone and finds somebody else to venture out into the deeper waters. But if you're going to follow Jesus and you're going to be serious about following Jesus, it's actually going to take you into the deeper waters, sometimes the waters you didn't want to go into, but that's where he's going to meet you, and that's where he's going to grow you. You realize there's so much in the Bible, and over again, almost through almost every book, there's references to water. So water embodies something incredible. It's part of creation, but it's also part of our deepest fears. Do you realize the ancient maps, when they really didn't know what was beyond the known territory of the world, they would put sea monsters and dragons to say, we don't know what's beyond there, but the further you go out, the more terrifying it must be. And be careful about not going just too far, because you never know what to expect. When you talk about Revelation, the beast comes from the sea. It emerges from that. When you talk about Jesus walking on water, we think it's a great miracle that he was able to walk on water, which it is, but it's telling us something else, because if you're in the mindset of Jewish people and you understand where the Bible comes from and you understand what we have today in terms of our understanding, they were terrified of the waters, because everything underneath the sea represents chaos, the demonic forces of this world, the beast that arises in Revelation. They know it, sense that there's nothing terrifying. If you've ever been on the ocean and a storm arises, it absolutely grips you with fear. And when Jesus walks on the water in the midst of a storm and the storm is stilled, hear this. What he's also saying is, I have dominion over that which terrifies you. When the storms are calm, the thing underneath that you don't know, that you fear, that you project your worst uncertainties and terror upon, I have dominion over that. I have power over it. I walk on top of it, and it will not fear you, and it will not harm you. In Luke 5:4, Jesus meets his disciples. When he finishes speaking, he says, put into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. It's the resurrection. They're out on a boat. They're heart-stricken because now Jesus has been crucified. He's standing on the shore. What does he say? Cast your nets on the deeper side. And when they do, they haul more fish they could possibly gather in, threatening to tear and shred the nets themselves. What's that story about? Cast your nets into the deeper waters. The moment they do that, they begin to see who he really is. When you go through the deep waters, Isaiah says, I'll be with you. When you go through the rivers of difficulty, you will not drown, Isaiah says again. This is what I want you to hear also, because we're digging deep. Ezekiel has this image, because water is so important. Just listen to him, because I think it's a template for our lives as well. Ezekiel 47. Now he brought me back to the entrance to the temple. I saw water pouring out from under the temple porch to the east. The water poured from the south of the temple, south of the altar. Then he took me out through the north gate, led me around the outside of the gate on the east. The water was gushing from under the south front of the temple. Hear this. He walked to the east with a measuring tape and measured off 1,500 feet, leading me through water that was ankle deep. He measured off another 1,500 feet, leading me through water that was knee deep. He measured off another 1,500 feet, leading me through water waist deep. He measured off another 1,500 feet. By now it was a river over my head, water to swim in, water no one could possibly walk through. Did you follow that? Because I think what he's telling us is a template for our own life. There are four sort of unfolding stages, ways in which Ezekiel walks into the water. First is ankle deep, where most of us live. It's safe. You don't have to do much. There's no risk in it. Just get wet, ankles. You can enjoy it. You never venture out. A lot of people do that. But then there's waters that take you to knee deep. You're still safe. Nothing's really going to happen to you. You're kind of in the water, but you're really not in the water. And then you come to waist deep, meaning it's real, and you know the possibility. There's a part of you doesn't want to go any further because you know it's going to go deeper. And as long as you're waist deep, you're still okay, but you're a little nervous and you want to go back to the shore, back to the shallow end, back to the safety of it as well. Finally, what does he do? He completely immerses you with water to the point you can't stand up. Your feet cannot hit the bottom. It overwhelms you. It overcomes you. It's above you and immerses you as well. Fourth time Ezekiel steps in the water, he can no longer walk in it. What he has to do is trust God will carry him through that. Sometimes I think God takes us into the deeper waters not to kill us, not to harm us, ultimately in order to save us, because that's where he resides. So in Matthew 14, I referenced it. Jesus walks on the water. Hear it. They're in the disciples in the boat by themselves. Jesus instructs them to go on a little bit further. Shortly before dawn, Jesus goes out to them. He's walking on the lake, and they're terrified. Jesus says to them immediately, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." What does Peter say? I love Peter. What does Peter say? "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you out on the water." What does Jesus say? Come. Then Peter got down on the boat, walked on the water, came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." I love Peter because Peter is in us and we're a part of Peter. Because he has his grandiose plans. He wants to show how great his faith is. He's the one who talks with such bravado. "I will never reject you, never deny you." And he does. "Jesus, just tell me to walk on water. I'll do it." He tries and he begins to sink. Peter's the one who wants so much to believe in the promise of Jesus. He'll go anywhere, do anything. But there's also the Peter inside of him that doesn't want to, scared to death. So he walks on water. You know what the real miracle of that story is? The real miracle in the story is not that Jesus saves Peter from drowning. The real miracle of that story is not that Jesus actually walks on the water because he can. You know what the real miracle of that story is? That Peter had enough faith and courage to actually step out of the boat and onto the water. There's an old midrash story. It's out of the Old Testament that they used to just sort of write these little things on the side notes, kind of help you understand what was going on. So when the Bible talks about Moses parting the Red Sea, a little notation on the side, the midrash says, when Moses commanded the waters to be parted, nothing happened. And for a long time, nothing happened. Until somebody was brave enough to put their foot in the water, and then the seas parted. I don't know about you, but there's a thread in these stories. There's a thread in your life. There's a thread in my life. You know what the thread is? The thread is we keep waiting on God. God, come. God, help me fix my problems, ease my pain. God, help me to find what I'm searching for. And you know what these passages tell me? God's also waiting on us. Will you just take a step? Will you just go into the deeper waters and trust me? Do you have enough faith and courage to get out of this shallow, trivial life and step into something deep and profound and good? And yes, it'll be scary. And yes, there'll be uncertainties. And yes, you will not know where you're going. But I'll be with you. And the waters will not overwhelm you nor consume you. What I love about this church is we're on a journey. I think as individuals, we're always on a journey, but we've come together, which means we're on a journey together. Which means if this church is ever going to be what God's called it to be, we can't play it safe. Can't stay in the shallow end. We're going to have to step out into the deeper waters where God already is waiting for us by faith, and he will be with us.